On the verge of the 19th century, Hegel developed his famous system of dialectics, with which, in the spirit of German idealism, he ambitiously tried to capture the whole essence of the spirit and its development through history. With this purpose, he wrote a series of books which are infamous for their inaccessibility, but have nevertheless prevailed as one of the most important and always relevant philosophical texts. With the system of dialectics, Hegel allows us to engulf and explain entirely contradictory tendencies of the spirit and, as an extension of the whole society, and place them in the wider historical development. The universality of the dialectical process has been tried and tested in many different fields and by many different philosophers. It can be found in, for example, economic policies by Marx, political views of Sartre, and even still today with Zizek's critique of ideology. Today, however, I want to seek this universal process elsewhere, namely in the world of music, by following the path paved by the musicologist and philosopher Theodor Adorno. In his unfinished book, Beethoven, Philosophy of Music, Adorno shows us that in the hands of Beethoven, the sonata form became the embodiment of Hegel's dialectics. Beethoven achieved that by exposing the dialogue between the most popular and extensive musical form of his time, sonata form in the role of a totality, and its individual themes in the roles of individuals that construct that totality, before pitting the two against each other in a dialectical battle. And aside from this kind of analysis being a great tool for further dissecting and understanding the core principles that give the music its complexity and value, Adorno also emphasized the philosophical truths that such great works of art can reveal about its maker's society when properly analyzed. In this video essay, I want to take a closer look at the unlikely connection between Hegel's dialectics and sonata form. Above all, I'm interested in how is it possible to find the same philosophical essence in the books of Hegel and the music of Beethoven, who were, by the way, both born in the year 1770. And then, like Adorno recommended, I want to see what their work tells us about the society in the era of the French Revolution. Then we will take a look at the true potential of dialectics in music, found in the finale of Mahler's Sixth Symphony, whose dialectical process I'll again substantiate with Adorno's stance that all great art is a reflection of core societal contradictions and injustices. So, without further ado, let's take a look at the dialectical process itself as presented to us by Hegel. I decided to tackle Hegel's dialectics through the famous master and slave metaphor, taken from his most influential book, Phenomenology of Spirit, in which he explains the development of spirit through history with the dialectical process. As I have mentioned, the dialectical process, as constructed by Hegel, avoids comprehensive readings at every turn and consequently remains inaccessible to most people. However, the master and the slave metaphor stands out from this, as it doesn't only clearly explain some of the core concepts of the dialectics, but also allows us to directly use the otherwise abstract dialectical thought on concrete examples in the real world or in other media, for example in sonata form. The master-slave dialectic begins with a consciousness which wants to figure out who and what it is in itself. It achieves this by putting itself in a negative relation to an object or to a different consciousness and negates it as its other. Here, the consciousness for the first time sees itself from the eyes of another and thus can say the words "you are" and consequently "I am." With this, self-consciousness is formed. In other words, self-consciousness exists only when another consciousness acknowledges it. So, how we see ourselves is dependent on how others see us. With this, the consciousness has discovered that there exists its negation, something that represents and is a personification of its absence. This means that it itself is replaceable, not necessary. Feeling threatened, a battle begins between the two consciousnesses until one prevails, which declares itself the master, and his other, the negation that made his self-consciousness even possible in the first place, is declared his slave. For the master to once again strengthen his role in the world and become independent, he has to actively oppress the slave by taking away his independence and necessity. He assures him that he can kill him anytime he wants. Self-consciousness of the master is built on domineering over the slave, so he can actualize the image of the strong, presiding master that he has built for himself. Here we run into an issue. The master in reality can't kill the slave, as he needs him as his other, so he can even define who he is. A master, after all, needs a slave to be a master. Therefore, the master has to always stay dissatisfied. For him to reach the highest level of self-consciousness, he both depends on the slave and has to destroy him. All of a sudden, we realize that the master is in fact dependent on his slave. He needs him to affirm and explain his existence, which itself is rooted in despising and dominating over the slave. This gives the slave incredible power, as he, on the other hand, isn't dependent on the master. He can see that his work that he's been doing in the place of the master explains his existence much better than the master can. And once he realizes that, he becomes free. The master, in his dependence on the slave, doesn't pose any real threat. The slave can rid of his master at any time and affirm his existence as an independent self through his work and interaction with the outside world. If you haven't fully grasped this yet, don't worry, as we'll go over this many times. Now, some of you may have heard Hegelian dialectics explained in a different way, namely as a process in three stages: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. If we were to convert our master and slave metaphor to this format, our thesis, or our first statement, would be something in the lines of "the master needs to oppress the slave." This would be followed by an antithesis, or a negation of the first statement, something like "the master depends on the slave." So, here is our contradiction that demands confrontation between the two ideas, out of which the synthesis will be born, a third statement that incorporates the contradiction of the thesis and antithesis. So, our synthesis could be: even though the master dominates the slave, he soon becomes the one in chains, as he needs the slave to be a master, while the slave does not need him. I'm mentioning this version as sonata form fits seemingly perfectly with this description. It starts with the exposition, where we get introduced to two themes. The first theme, or what would be our thesis, sets the mood and, more importantly, the main tonality of the whole sonata movement. Then there's the second theme, our antithesis, which escapes the world of the main theme and presents to us an alternative of a different character and in a new tonality. Here, it's crucial that the second theme achieves a strong cadence in the new tonality, which cements the second theme as a protagonist in the movement. This, of course, causes tonal and contrast conflict between our two themes that, like in our dialectical example, pushes the music forward as it demands to be resolved if we ever want to achieve stability. This leads into the development section, where our themes confront each other in direct conflict. They generally break up into smaller motifs that get expanded and elaborated on through various tonalities. The goal of the development is then to return the material to the original shapes of the themes, as heard in the exposition, and return us to the original tonality of the movement. This is exactly what happens in the third part of the sonata, recapitulation, or our synthesis. Both themes appear in their original forms, but with one crucial change. Both themes appear in the main tonality of the movement, finally resolving the tonal conflict set up by the exposition. Now, as perfect as this comparison might seem, it's important to point out that sonata in itself isn't the personification of dialectical thought that Adorno talked about. It's true that in it we can find thesis, the first theme, antithesis, the second theme, mediation between the two ideas, the development section, and synthesis, recapitulation. But as we have discovered, Hegel's dialectics is a much more complex and intricate process with crucial relations that we simply cannot envelop with the words thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, words which Hegel himself never used. True Hegel's dialectic can be spotted only with the arrival of Beethoven, who exposed the dialogue between individual themes and the sonata form as a whole. So, between unique individuals with their own aspirations and personalities on one hand, and the oppressive totality that in the name of unity strictly dictates the shape, function, and goal of its individual parts on the other. The artistic dialectic is actuated within the communication that is established between the creative individual that seeks expression and the objectivity of forms and languages already constituted by tradition, between the individual Beethoven and the tonal system that does not allow single melodic moments that do not derive from the mere fundamental harmonic relations. Now, I know this sounds messy, so let's take it apart. Sonata form, just like any other totality, is forced to make compromises. If it wants coherence, unity, and order, it needs to strictly dictate the form and function of its individual parts. There has to be a single main tonality which needs to prevail in the recapitulation by engulfing both themes, because that is what retrospectively makes the whole coherent in the first place. Without resolving this tonal contradiction, unity and order cannot be achieved, and consequently, the sonata is weakened in its function. This means that sonata form cannot allow for moments of individual expression, and the themes have to concede their own aspirations and goals to the goals of the whole. If we now use our knowledge of the master and slave dialectic, we can see that sonata form as an oppressive system that denies individual expression to its themes with the purpose of strengthening its own function takes on the role of the master, while the individual themes that want to rise above the limitations of the structure and cement themselves as unique individuals take on the role of the slave. And just as in Hegel's dialectic, the sonata as a master is really unable to hold its individual themes at bay, as it depends on them to even exist, while the themes don't necessarily need a top-down construction that dictates when and how they will appear. So at the end, even though they're technically the slaves, the individual themes hold much more power and are free to subjugate the totality to their own expressive needs. As I have mentioned in the introduction, I'd like to answer the question of how Beethoven and Hegel could reach the same philosophical essence on completely different fields with Adorno's stance that every great work of art is a reflection of core societal truths of the artist's life. Beethoven and Hegel, both born in 1770, lived in the time of the French Revolution, where ideas about brotherhood, unity, and freedom echoed throughout Europe. However, these slogans bring up an important question which could have influenced dialectical thought of both Beethoven and Hegel, and which I teased before. How to achieve a unity or a telos, a whole, without destroying or limiting the freedom of the individuals that construct it. As we know, the French Revolution did bring in many radical reforms, such as successfully abolishing feudalism and other privileges held by the nobility, notably exemption from tax, and enacted equality before law, opened the public office to all, and introduced many other decrees that directly improved lives of the masses. However, it also brought in a brutal reign of terror, with mass censorship and executions, and ended with a self-proclaimed emperor, all in the name of preserving unity and order of the revolution. As Adorno and Horkheimer noted in their book Dialectics of Enlightenment, Instead of leading to a truly free society built on equality and solidarity, the enlightened ideals prevailed over the individual and forced him to leave his own aspirations behind so that he could embody the revolution itself. This homogenization in the name of unity did lead to a strengthened whole, but also demanded the oppression and destruction of individual tendencies, a practice that they wanted to liberate themselves from in the first place. Beethoven famously supported the ideas of the French Revolution, as seen by the fact that he initially named his Third Symphony Bonaparte in honor of Napoleon. However, as soon as the word got out that Napoleon crowned himself the emperor, Beethoven furiously crossed out the original title and renamed it to Heroic Symphony to commemorate the memory of a great man, or Eroica. This is fitting for the E-flat major symphony, whose themes in the sonata form first movement are injected with the drive to achieve liberation and, like the slave in Hegel, through their efforts rise above the limitations of their strict master sonata form. Be it either the defiant and tonally dissonant C-sharp present in the first theme that directly undermines the main tonality of the movement, E-flat major, that it would in theory even have to affirm. Or the insertion of a completely new theme in the middle of the development section that is reached as the form of the movement is seemingly ripped apart and just the same undermines the whole for its individual purposes. By submitting the rules of the sonata to the expression and aspirations of the individual themes, Beethoven clearly engages with the Hegelian dialectic and through his art strives for the liberation of the individual. One of the reasons that Beethoven was even able to compose such radical innovations into his work is that he liberated himself from the master-slave dialectic that pretty much every composer and artist in the Western tradition preceding Beethoven was a part of. Throughout history, the artist was forced to subjugate his own aspirations and creative drive to the needs and taste of the court or church. The role of the artist was seen as any other craftsman, and his job was to appease the needs of the wealthy. However, Beethoven saw the hierarchical court and church structures the composers were placed in as what they were, unneeded and limiting. Following the example set by Mozart, he became a freelance composer defined not by the taste and needs of the ruling classes, but by his interaction with the outside world through his art. And with that out of the way, it's Mahler time. Even though Beethoven may have been the first one to inject his themes with the drive to achieve self-consciousness, I feel comfortable saying that the dialectical dialogue between the individual themes and sonata form reached its peak with Mahler, the great Austrian composer from the late 19th, early 20th century. As Seth Monahan showed in his monumental book Mahler's Symphonic Sonatas, on which the whole following analysis is based on, sonata form movements from Mahler's oeuvre construct extremely complex narratives that are told through a battle between bottom-up and top-down construction of music, so a battle between the predetermined and rigid top-down construction of sonata form and spontaneous, liberating and democratic bottom-up construction of the individual themes. This process, of course, relies on the same principles as the master and the slave dialectic that Adorno exposed in Beethoven. And in this light, I want to tackle Mahler's most colossal and structurally complex movement, the Finale of the Sixth, which pushes the idea of dialectics to its logical extremes. It is in fact the intricately structured dialectical process that is at the core of the movement's drama, and that at the end leads the music to its infamously tragic fate. In this analysis, I'll focus only on the colossal finale of the Sixth, as the movements preceding it, as amazing as they are in their own right, primarily serve the function of setting up the half-hour demonic drama that closes the symphony. And as I have mentioned, the basis of the following analysis is Seth Monahan's book Mahler's Symphonic Sonatas, so all of the credit for the interpretation and the terminology used goes to him. If you're interested in Mahler's music or just want to see an example of an extremely well-crafted analytical approach, I highly recommend getting your hands on the full book. So, without further ado, let's dive into the finale, conducted by Bernstein with the Vienna Philharmonic. The finale, as I have mentioned, is in sonata form, with introductory complexes placed before each of the sonata's four main parts. It is in the first of these introductory complexes that we get introduced to the main protagonists, or our different consciousnesses, in the process of forming. And right in the opening bars of the movement, we already get a taste of the dialectical relations and power dynamics at play. The movement opens in the key of C minor with a colorful augmented sixth sonority accompanying a winding melody, highlighted in pink, interwoven into a complex texture. Notice that it is constructed out of an octave leap and a turn motive, which will prove to be important later on. But before this idea could finish its phrase, the music is without any warning usurped by a violent, screeching motive in the tonality of A minor, highlighted in brown. This idea brashly changes the tonality and replaces the intricate texture and colorful harmony with rigid and dull homogeny. With this, Mahler makes sure that we understand that these aren't just two ideas, one following the other. As Seth Monahan put it, C minor wasn't followed by A minor, but was expelled, annihilated by it. After this, the music is left in a state of limbo, where different march motifs float around the texture without harmonic or rhythmic support, as A minor is proven to be unable to gather sufficient momentum to construct a theme of its own. This leaves the space open for our third protagonist, or consciousness, to reveal himself. This one will later be embodied with the tonality of D major, so I'll refer to it as such and mark it with yellow. Under its guidance, fragmented motifs gradually start to pierce through the thick texture and assemble into somewhat durable formations. But just as a theme is about to form, the music is hit by a process of disintegration which breaks off different motivic cells and violently destroys them one by one. This process of the two consciousnesses forming complex and interesting themes just for A minor to violently destroy their ambitions continues not only through the introduction but throughout the whole movement. However, while A minor is skilled at brutish destruction, it is presented as virtually useless at connecting motives and gathering momentum. It doesn't have any recognizable themes, for now appearing only as a dull and violent motive. This is why there's always negative space left behind its usurpations, which is skillfully filled by the other two consciousnesses. This process repeats with C minor stepping in after the previous disintegration with a fully formed chorale. One of its main characteristics is the turning motive that is, in the typical Mahler fashion, first presented as a part of the melody before being right away incorporated into the texture, serving as counterpoint to the next phrase. This same turning motive, or its inversion at least, originates from the searing introduction melody that welcomed us in the first bars of the movement, so I'll give it a pink outline. The chorale then continues its phrase, reaching a secondary dominant before being interrupted by the same violent motive as in the first bars of the movement. Only that now it isn't a triad built on A, but a dominant 7th chord built on G, the dominant of C, signaling that the incompetent A minor is losing control even of its own motives. After that, the D major consciousness swoops right in, leading to a second, more powerful statement of the chorale that this time also incorporates the octave leap from the introduction melody. The chorale then successfully gathers sufficient momentum and prepares for the launch of the exposition in C minor. This is again followed by the same violent motive that caused C minor's destruction in the beginning of the movement, but this time the motive doesn't interrupt the chorale's phrase, but completes it, as it is now played firmly in C and even resolves the dominant chord of the previous bar. With this, C minor has skillfully used the violent tools of A minor for its own purposes. The motives from the introduction then start to assemble into stable formations as the last preparations for the exposition start in C minor take hold. And just as it might seem that the exposition will launch under the authority of C minor, Mahler reminds us of the dialectical relations present in the movement. In the last seconds, as the C minor tonic was already in sight, the texture starts to thicken and the basses unnoticeably introduce the note E natural, which soon becomes an E major chord, the dominant of A minor. With this, A minor forcibly displaces C minor for the third time and usurps all of its effort at building momentum and at connecting motives for its own purposes, starting the exposition in A minor. Here, let's take a step back and do an overview. In the introduction, we got introduced to three separate protagonists, and if you're clever, you may have already guessed that A minor is the master of the dialectical process, while the other two consciousnesses both take on the roles of slaves. They are the ones doing the actual work by forming themes and gathering momentum, and are consequently much more expressive and interesting. A minor, on the other hand, in its reliance on brute force and, instead of expression, is skilled at the destruction of individual tendencies of the other two consciousnesses, is really serving as a personification of the sonata's ambitions to achieve a homogeneous totality where individuals are subjugated and fully incorporated into the whole. Each time that it has appeared so far, it was only with the purpose of destroying the individualistic ambitions of the other two consciousnesses and actively pushed for uniformity and dullness. Its personification, as we've seen, isn't a theme, but rather a screeching motive consisting of a two-chord progression. A major going to A minor, played over a thumping rhythm. This motive, named by musicologists as the motto of the symphony, is not organically derived from the music, but is rather forced onto it from above in the so-called top-down construction. With its dull, harmonic and rhythmic shape and colorless texture, it doesn't have a possibility or even a desire for expression, which is reinforced by the fact that throughout the symphony it always retains its rigid skeleton, as if intruding from outside of the music to drive us to our fate. Its sole function is the destruction of individualistic tendencies and at the same time to reinforce A minor as the tonic. To reiterate, the sonata and its A minor personification as a master isn't cruel and violent because it is in its core evil or something. As we've learned, in Hegel's dialectic the master has to oppress and subjugate his slave to affirm his own self-consciousness as a strong master. And the same goes for sonata form or any other kind of totality. If the sonata wants coherence as a whole, it has no other choice but to violently destroy the expressive ambitions of the individual themes that construct it. This is at the core of the dialectical process. To justify his own existence, the master both depends on the slave and has to destroy him at the same time. The slave, on the other hand, or the individual themes in our example, doesn't need the master, as he can justify his existence through his own work with which he interacts with the world around him. Because of this, it becomes only a question of time when the slave will become aware of his situation and rise above the master as a fully autonomous and free individual. Mahler, however, complicates things with the inclusion of two different consciousnesses, both in the role of a slave. They are both, of course, fighting the oppressive A minor, but as we'll see, sharing a common enemy does not make them allies. As the exposition starts, More and more evidence suggests that A minor is the agent of sonata form itself, the master that strives for broader coherence of the whole, achievable only by the destruction of the individual. The first theme of the exposition, constructed out of the motives from the introduction, is now under the authority of A minor and consequently becomes extremely bland and rigid. Its only function becomes serving the role of the first theme in the sonata form, which doesn't allow for any surplus individualistic expressive tendencies or development. The theme becomes ruthless in its comically strict 4-bar phrases, existing only in the spaces determined for it by the whole in exclusively top-down construction. I'll play the first few phrases and really try to home in how bland and rigid the 4-bar phrases sound. This rigidity comes from the fact that each 4-bar phrase is further constructed out of two smaller 2-bar units, each of which starts and ends on the exact same chord. In the first phrase, each of the units both starts and ends on the tonic A minor chord. The second phrase then does the same thing with the chord E minor, just that it ends on the dominant E major. The third begins and ends with the subdominant D, and it is only the fourth 4-bar phrase that starts on a B-flat major chord and ends on the dominant. This is followed by one last, a bit more continuous phrase that neatly wraps up the theme with a textbook perfect authentic cadence. This kind of architectonic, exclusively top-down construction does lead to a more coherent whole, but comes at a price of violent suppression of any kind of individualistic expressive excesses. Finishing with a textbook perfect authentic cadence in A minor, the first theme simply disappears with one last statement of the motto, as it has completed its function within the sonata. The following transition to the second theme is by contrast much more memorable and interesting, which is explained by the fact that it is derived from the C minor chorale from the introduction. It, of course, just the same contains and develops the octave leap and the turn motif from the introductory melody, while also skillfully recycling the march rhythm from the first theme as its accompaniment. With a sweeping melody and a firm rhythm, it right away starts a process to reinstate C as the tonic. It manages to reach a half cadence on G, and just as perfect cadence seems in its reach, the texture gets invaded by a new set of motifs that corrupt the cadential attempt and reinstate A as the tonic with the motto. This whole process is repeated, but this time the new set of motifs is much more prevalent and slowly drowns out the transition theme in a process of liquidation. These rigid motifs, characterized by their specific and familiar rhythm, are in fact all derived from the motto. Here we're introduced to another tool of the totality that aids it in its quest to achieve perfect homogeny. While the motto can work towards a harmonic and rhythmic uniformity, melody is out of its reach. For this purpose, in the finale, the motto gives birth to a group of motifs that Seth Monahan in his book named generic motifs, based on their inorganic nature, so I'll follow suit and mark them with brown, the same as the motto. These generic motifs share the common element of the characteristic motto rhythm, so ta, 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 and also their plain blandness. Everywhere they appear, they bring about a process of liquidation that disassembles the developed and expressive themes into dull fragments before incorporating them into a unified, homogeneous texture. This proves to be one of the main tools that the sonata totality uses to fight for the complete destruction of the individual themes, with the goal of achieving complete unity and uniformity and consequently strengthening itself. And so, the cadence on C is denied twice, before the liquidation process completely takes over and disassembles the theme into nothingness, ending right back where we started, in bland and expressionless A minor. Exit from the dark status quo is presented to us by the second theme under the authority of D major. Its goal, as we've learned, is to achieve a strong cadence in the secondary tonality and with that gain independence and individuality. But as the theme plays out, something seems off. Its phrases are a little too rigid and its melody too mechanic. And if we take a closer look, the reason quickly reveals itself. We can see that the second theme is constructed out of the same generic rhythmic motive that we can also find in the rigid first theme and which originates from the pessimistic motto. In the context of the dialectical process, this is disastrous for the second theme, because as long as it is motivically dependent on the master, it cannot affirm itself as an individual. Consequently, the theme is quite inefficient and static, leaving us without much hope for a strong affirmation of the secondary tonality. That is until, in the middle of a phrase, the second theme is suddenly freed from the generic motives and springs to life. Rigid repetition is replaced with a beautiful endless melody, tightly constructed out of an idea derived not from the first theme, but from the searing introductory melody, a suspension leading to a descending line that I highlighted in green. Interestingly, the octave leap motif from the introductory melody also makes an appearance. Wasting no time, the secondary theme creates a strong drive towards a cadence in D major. But soon after the theme locks on the dominant of D major, in a process that has become known to us, the music is invaded by the motto's generic motives and the attempt at cadence is graphically interrupted. With this, the exposition ends with the failure of the second theme at achieving a cadence to affirm the secondary tonality. Regardless, we still have a reason to be optimistic, as what follows is the development section where sonata form doesn't have its full power and the themes are much freer. Before the development proper starts, the introductory complex returns, now infused with tonal and motivic spillage from the second theme. The searing introduction melody is now in D minor and played in 3-part imitation. As this idea evaporates, we're left in a state of limbo, seemingly outside of the sonata's tonal drama, with fragments of the second theme being passed around. After a while, the march returns and reintroduces conflict into the music, suppressing each attempt of the second theme at stabilizing. The second theme eventually outmaneuvers the march and again fully assembles in an almost exact form as in the exposition, only that this time it also incorporates the turn motif from the introductory melody. Even more, it again reignites the drive for a strong cadence in D major, its original tonality, as if the exposition space was forcefully reopened in an attempt at correcting its failure. But once again, as the theme reaches the dominant pedal, preparing for a cadence, the music is invaded by generic motifs that sway the music to D minor, but the theme is undeterred. It finds its way back to D major and re-establishes the dominant pedal, but with it again come the generic motifs, which announce the catastrophe that follows. This time, the cadential attempt of the second theme is destroyed with unprecedented violence that is underlined by Mahler's addition of a giant hammer into the orchestra, which is struck at the moment of the denied cadential attempt. But as the music continues, an even more disturbing fact is revealed to us. We find out that the hammer wasn't struck by A minor, the master, but by C minor, the other slave. After the brutal destruction of the cadential drive of the second theme, the music is usurped by the chorale from the introduction and accompanied by the same march-like scales as the transition theme, representing C minor. It seems that there's room for only one slave in our dialectic, which causes C minor to attempt to violently destroy its competition. It wants to secure victory for itself, and cadential attempts of the second theme could prove to be a threat. And as we see, to achieve his goals, he is more than prepared to use violence and even rely on the exact same methods as the master. As the hammer theme continues, it incorporates the same generic motives that caused its usurpation in the exposition, now used for its perverted goals. However, the second theme proves to be incredibly stubborn in its aspirations. Right after its brutal destruction by the hammer, it magically returns in an optimistic and almost cheerful utopian state with no generic motives in sight, and in tonic major, the best possible of all outcomes. The whole theme is even played over a strong tonic pedal, and its melody sings freely with no motivic and harmonic conflict. This could very be the state that it tried so hard to reach, far removed from the status quo that the sonata forcefully tries to instill. However, it has reached this place prematurely in the development section. And so the music must move on. The second theme briefly tries to reach for a cadence, but is derailed by the ever more present generic motives that lead into a passage of complete chaos and liquidation, with superimposed seventh chords that seem to lead us into the abyss. But then, in one of my favorite moments, three colossal chords suddenly and confidently clear the thick texture, and with a following sounding of the motto place us firmly in C minor, setting the ground for the start of the development proper. As C minor finally gains the opportunity to take over the music, its real aspirations are revealed. Unlike the passionate and enthusiastic second theme that longs for a major mode fulfillment in a place as far removed as possible from the militaristic march of the first theme, the stoic and industrious C minor doesn't want to escape the sonata, but rather reclaim the tonic authority and take over its material. And this is exactly what happens next. After a few soundings of the motto in C that cement its authority over the music, C minor takes over the rigid first theme and shows us what the theme could have been if it was not held back by the anti-individualistic tendencies of the master. What was in the exposition under the authority of A minor, a generic, rigid, and a bland theme, is now transformed into a dynamic, memorable, and developed march. As the theme is suddenly no longer bound by the strict and repetitive 4-bar phrases and no longer drowns in motto rhythms, it is finally free to construct a complex and expressive passage with the march motifs chasing each other in playful counterpoint. To absolutely ensure us that the motto and A minor don't have any power over the section, the music even gradually modulates from C minor to C major, an inversion of the major to minor motto progression. So the negation of the motto is actually included into the theme itself. In reality, this is just as much a finale that could have been as the second theme's utopian vision. However, as we're familiar by now, generic motifs gradually intrude into the texture and after a few attempts cause the process of liquidation to take hold. This time, the liquidation process was caused by the second theme, which takes advantage of the chaos and appears in another utopian image, once again free from any generic motives. This time, it appears in a really beautiful duet with the searing introduction theme, revealing their shared roots. In this state, the theme ignites an even greater drive towards the D major cadence. The dominant is approached with great exuberance and passion, where tragically, as we might already suspect, again appear generic motives, this time unnoticeably incorporated right into the melody itself, that derail the cadential attempt into the second, even more violent stroke of the hammer. The hammer is again revealed to be in the hands of C minor. This time, C minor doesn't hide its roots and merges the chorale and the transition theme in a duet. The music soon seems to start falling apart from the sheer violence that it has exerted. The generic motifs that are incorporated into the hammer theme start another process of liquidation until all we're left with is a passage of tight counterpoint formed out of two most basic motivic cells of the finale, the octave leap and the turn motif. This is all played over a dominant pedal on G, preparing us for the start of the recapitulation. But to ensure that the recapitulation will start and firmly stay in C minor, a loose end has to be tied up. And that is the resilience of the second theme in its drive for a D major cadence. So, to be absolutely sure that the second theme won't stand in its way for imposing tonal authority over the sonata, C minor reignites the drive for a cadence in D, even helps it reach the dominant chord, before brutally thwarting the cadential attempt with the return of the introductory complex's augmented sixth sonority in C minor. The following recapitulation, which is again preceded by an introductory complex, continues, even with the motto firmly in C minor. This means that it is C minor that uses the motto to brutishly suppress the complex introduction and replace it with rigid homogeny. As it turns out, through the constant oppression of the second theme, C minor itself became violent, messy, and ineffective. With the goal of deposing the master, it violently subjugated and oppressed the second theme, and with that he himself picked up A minor's brutish character and slack. Consequently, C minor is completely incapable at forming a theme and stabilizing the music. Tragically, The introductory complex tracks the opening of the movement exactly, only now that instead of A minor, it stays in C minor. C minor's slack gives another chance to the second theme, which, with its appearance despite the two graphic suppressions, again shows its incredible resilience and unstoppable will. After the drive for a cadence in D was destroyed by C minor, the second theme has to find a new tonality. And after a bit of searching and motivic play, the theme is suddenly revived in B flat major. Regardless, the theme gathers sufficient momentum and even commences its own chorale, a negation of its C minor counterpart in the introduction to the exposition. But even though the newly formed chorale promisingly reaches the dominant of B flat major, this event again coincides with a disruption from the march. follows is a swift transition to the recapitulation. While both protagonists are in their weakened forms, A minor makes a return and starts a colossal process of liquidation where motifs from all theme groups are commingled in a thick texture and played over a giant pedal on E. There's of course the second theme, still reaching up from the previous passage. Then there's the march rhythm from the first theme, the hammer theme, which also serves, as we've mentioned, as a culmination of the C minor chorale and the transition theme, and its cascading scalar accompaniment. And of course, there's also a barrage of generic motifs that lead into a return of the motto rhythm in the timpani. After that, the texture starts to slowly get reduced until motifs from the first theme start to prevail, preparing us for the start of the recapitulation. Just as in the exposition, A minor has stolen all of the work put in by the slave and in a single move took over the tonality. The second theme, which is still stubbornly hanging on for dear life, continues to sing in counterpoint, but is slowly and deliberately drowned out by the first theme. What remains is a note for note, even in the orchestration, exact recapitulation of the first theme. The theme, despite the lengthy development, hasn't internalized any growth or progress, and even more, by gradually and deliberately drowning out the motivic spillage of the second theme, is actually actively working towards an exact reprise. The only function that the first theme fulfills is determined by the sonata form, leaving no space for individual expression. Bottom-up construction dictates that Mahler's characters show individual volition, the impulse to resist the architectonic grid that would restrain them. It is not merely that the first theme lacks such autonomy. By recurring unchanged, merely to delineate the sonata pattern, it becomes the grid itself. As a theme, its function is entirely top-down. It fails to be a character at all. As the first theme again concludes with the textbook perfect authentic cadence in A minor and one less sounding of the motto, we witness an even greater tragedy befall on C minor and the second theme. In the most important part of the sonata, recapitulation, the sonata form takes away any possibility of individual expression, as both consciousnesses are assigned the role of a transition theme at the same time. In rigid counterpoint and firmly in A minor, both themes are played at the same time, actively preventing each other from achieving self-affirmation. In the texture is also included the cascading accompaniment of the hammer theme, and of course generic motives that hold the themes at bay. And the same passage that in the exposition was used by C minor to lock on its dominant in an attempt to retake tonal authority is now used to firmly reinforce the A minor tonic, complete with a sounding of the motto. The rest of the transition follows the exposition bar by bar with minor adjustments. Generic motives once again intrude and lead into a process of liquidation that this time completely dissolves the transition theme into the texture and eliminates it. With last efforts, the hammer theme is briefly revived and tries to contest its destruction, but is overpowered, leading to the final process of disintegration. The sonata starts to systematically destroy what's left of individual tendencies, reducing the C minor area to its basic motivic cells, the octave leap and the term motive. This liquidation leads into the chaotic passage from the development section, where snippets of the second theme starts to pierce through the texture. After all of this, the second theme, with its last powers, again appears with its signature drive towards a cadence, this time trying to tonicize the tonic major that it tasted in the development section. The theme opens up with imitations and elaborations of the introduction melody that has at this point become an integral part of the second theme. But just as the theme properly commences, the timpani starts to mockingly pound the motto rhythm, and the horns soon dominate the texture with generic motives. Right before the cadence, the motto motives move out of the foreground and unnoticeably incorporate themselves into the texture, giving us one last hope for a cadence in tonic major. A minor suppresses this final attempt at cadence with one last return of the introductory complex, now for the first time in A minor, and reveals its main goal. The totality does not merely sanction the destruction of the individual, as Adorno writes, rather it seeks to eradicate the idea of the individual altogether in favor of the denuded generic similarity. The master, in our case, does not recognize that he needs and depends on the slave. In efforts to empower himself, the totality is blind in the consequences of obliterating the individual impulses that construct it. We are again placed in the introductory complex. This time, the once searing theme is played in sour inverse counterpoint at the tritone, causing it to simply fall apart and give way to the violent sounding of the motto in A. At this point, only a fistful of basic motivic cells remain. These are the turn motive, the dotted rhythm, and the octave leap, all originating from the searing introduction theme that seems as though is the catalyst for the individualistic tendencies for expression and liberation of the entire movement. It is from these motives that both the C minor chorale and the second theme drew their impulse for resistance against the sonata totality, and it is these very motives that in the coda are the very last cells hanging on for life. This places incredible weight on the coda of the symphony, as in these main figures, the pair of distinct narrative threads, the C minor area and the second theme, converge into one single idea: the individualistic resistance impulse against the oppressive totality that was the main driving force of the entire movement. And as the finale draws to a close, these shadowy motives slowly and powerlessly evaporate in the monotonous texture and incorporate into the grid itself, signaling the final destruction of the individual. In the last bars, the motto plays for one last time, this time with only the A minor chord, reaching its final state of complete monotony, blandness, and emptiness, but consequently also a state of coherence that the sonata tried to reach from the very beginning. This is followed by silence. The master, in his aspirations to empower himself, has definitively destroyed slave's autonomy and killed him. However, without the slave, the master himself cannot exist. Listen to the whole coda. The tragedy of the Sixth Symphony doesn't come from the destruction of a symphonic hero, but from a blindness from both the master and the slaves to the dialectical process. The symphony forces us to view classicism from a completely different angle, one where we're aware of the implicit violence and brutality enacted upon the individual that coherence and unity of the totality demands. Mahler's Sixth takes this concept only a step further, portraying an image of a voracious collective that capriciously liquidates the idea of an individual in the name of achieving order and coherence, and that at the end is tragically left unrestrained as its subjects that are otherwise fully capable and determined to achieve liberation are occupied with infighting that transforms them into brutish and depersonalized machines. The end product is the complete destruction of the individual and his transformation into the grid itself, leaving behind nothing but silence. For the end, I'd like to take a step away from Monahan's book, as rather than seeking biographical elements in the music, I'm interested in searching Mahler's extremely intricate dialectical process for reflections of core societal truths and their corresponding contradictions and injustices in the style of Adorno. Parallels between the sonata form, as presented to us by Mahler in the finale of his Sixth Symphony, and societal action on the verge of the 20th century are in fact numerous and go much deeper than it would seem on the first look. I want to especially draw your attention to the parallels between the bloodthirsty sonata form serving the role of a master with self-destructive tendencies and the European powers at the brink of the First World War, and how Mahler, through the tonalities of D major and C minor, accurately portrays infighting of different oppressed groups. If C minor and the second theme would have worked together, they could have easily freed themselves from the chains of their master and preserved their individuality, as A minor, in its rigid, self-destructive tendencies, is presented as almost comically incompetent. In its blind rage, the totality doesn't recognize that it depends on the subjects for preserving its self-consciousness or in fact its whole existence. However, as portrayed by Mahler in the finale of the Sixth, mirroring many historical attempts of revolution with terrifying accuracy, the master doesn't need to be efficient, as different oppressed groups, in the hopes of securing victory, take on the role of oppressing others and with that themselves become empty, inefficient and cruel masters. Examples of this type of dialectic can be found throughout history. Colonization of America, for example, relied on battles between different Native American tribes that were provoked by Europeans. While Marx, who, as I have mentioned, is another Hegelian thinker, would say that we don't need to look into the past for examples. He punctuated that one of the main tactics used by a capitalist society to preserve itself is pitting the working class against itself through the optics of competition. The workers, playing the roles of slaves in our dialectic, cannot cooperate and depose the unneeded ruling and oppressive capitalist class if they perceive each other as an economic threat, a reminder that they are replaceable, meaning that they need to compete with one another for jobs instead of recognizing each other as allies. Another tactic used by the ruling classes to split up different oppressed groups was experienced by Mahler himself. Born in the year 1870 in Bohemia as a Jew, Mahler faced oppression and discrimination at every step of his life. Even though he was an internationally renowned conductor, he had an incredibly hard time gaining the title of the director of the Vienna Opera House in the year 1897. To be even considered, he had to revoke his Jewish faith and be baptized as a Christian. Mahler's oppression only intensified in the following decade through ever more prevalent anti-Semitic caricatures in the newspapers. Attacks reached their peak in the year 1907 when he was forced to resign as the director of the Vienna Opera House. Parallels between Europe at the brink of the rise of Nazism and Mahler's music were already drawn by Adorno. In Mahler's music, where the individual themes so adamantly refused to be lodged and incorporated into an empty and violent totality, he saw a clear condemnation of the very political and economic system that he himself dedicated his career on analyzing through his critical theory. One of his main interests was in the question, how do societies built on such clearly cruel and unfair hierarchies that destroy the lives of the masses, reduce individuals to arbitrary categories, and replace freedom and true individual fulfillment with empty consumerism, maintain their power? And as we've seen, Mahler engaged with this exact concept in his music and also in his life. Similarly to the themes in his music, Mahler was also persecuted because of his individuality and was forced to take on characteristics that were assigned to him by the Austrian authorities in the name of preserving unity and society. Mahler was, as an influential, popular, and successful Jew, extremely dangerous in the eyes of the Austrian authorities, as he directly undermined the dialectical image of Germans as masters and Jews as slaves. The Austrian authorities then, in blind rage and hopes of reaffirming their self-consciousness as masters, destroyed Mahler's career and the lives of millions of other Jewish people. However, Mahler wasn't persecuted only by the authorities, as he received attacks from critics, players, singers, and journalists in a daily manner. In times of extreme social injustices, the oppressed people started to fight each other over the made-up concept of race instead of actually dismantling the economic and political system that subjugated them and assigned them the roles of slaves in a cruel hierarchical dialectic. With this, they only ended up supporting the very oppressive system against which they should have been fighting all along.